ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Will Discussion with Agent Smith. Today is September the 3rd, 2023, and we are here to talk about the world, and I'll be playing some StarCraft in the background. This is meant to be a conversation, so if you have any questions and want to weigh in, you may do so, and also if you want to yell at us and give us some harsh criticism, we're open to that as well. Without any further ado, I will jump into voice chat with Mr. Agent Smith. Smith.
Hello.
Yo.
Hey.
Good day, Zion.
How are you?
Doing pretty well. Got to open my window today because the clouds pushed away the smoky air. Grateful for that.
There have been forest fires and stuff again?
Yeah, in BC, Canada. And it blows south into my territory. I'm in
trying to smoke you out.
Yeah, I'm in a very humid area, so we pretty much never get fires here, and it's not enough continuous force. There's too much development anyway, but north of us in British Columbia, they've been having lots of fires for a while. But aside from that, doing well. We got the last progression fight that we needed for our WoW guild this week, and generally have been boosting recruitment and having some pretty major gains. I remember telling you last week that I had a whole bunch of feedback that I've been getting kind of all at once, and it was a lot to take in, but I was able to make major progress on several fronts, and people are appeased and morale was thusly boosted. So it was the long-term win where you're short-term kind of made uncomfortable by realizing that a bunch of people are pissed off.
Oh, that sounds like it went about as well as it could.
Yep. Been playing a bunch of Baldur's Gate as well. That's fun. It's a really fun game to play with friends, too. You can play with up to 3 other people, so max party size is 4. Playing with one other person is really fun. I've been playing with a fellow streamer and real-life friend of mine in a duos campaign. We're running 1 paladin, 1 warlock, and then we each get to control 1 party member in addition to our character. And StarCraft has a change coming up. They're patching the game again, just trying to make some balance improvements, so it's cool to see that there's still active effort on that front. Yeah, it's been a pretty good week overall. How are you doing?
Can't complain. Had soup today. That's always a good day.
Yeah. Is it still hot as heck there?
Yeah, it's still pretty hot, but it's been moderating. It's definitely been getting better.
Just in the 90s, not in the 110s.
Yeah, 80s, 90s. It's definitely a lot more tolerable.
Mm-hmm.
And it's supposed to get cooler soon, so here's looking forward to that.
Good. Well,
Fingers crossed.
I did peruse some headlines and stuff, and between all the bunches of crap, there were a few things that chat mentioned that seemed kind of interesting. You mentioned Zelensky trying to make changes to leadership in Ukraine for corruption stuff. Moss pointed out that he appointed a new defense minister, or at least fired the old one.
Yeah, that just happened today.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so details are a little scarce, but he's actually replacing him with the guy who had been responsible for raising money abroad, basically, with other governments.
Mm-hmm.
So the way Zelensky phrased it kind of made it sound like they were kind of looking for a change in leadership, predicated more kind of on that. So it's not clear if there was like an explicit issue with corruption or if they just thought that this other guy would kind of be a better fit for the job.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know specifically about just what responsibilities the defense minister has in Ukraine. For example, just how much of a role he plays in the day-to-day management of Ukraine's war effort. But if it's less, if he is focused more on the political side of the conflict, putting a money guy in charge actually could make sense, since that's an important part of the war effort for Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
If lower level leaders are largely managing military decisions, this isn't necessarily an issue.
Yeah.
On the other hand, if it's in so much as the money guy is less experienced with, actual combat and military affairs, it could be a setback in that sense. But again, that just comes down to what kind of role the defense minister is supposed to be playing there. And I don't know the answer to that yet. I'd have to refer you to somebody who knows more about Ukrainian politics than I do.
So we'll see. Sounds like it's a pivot from a more military focused person to a more finances focused person.
Yeah. Yeah, and there was also a court case against Kolomoisky. I'm not sure how to pronounce his name. He's one of the oligarchs in Ukraine. And he's notable because he's the oligarch that had actually backed Zelensky when he was running for president. He's the guy that actually owned the TV station that bought and showed his TV show back when Zelensky was still an actor.
Oh.
So there's a lot of links between Kolomoisky and Zelensky, and that made some people think that maybe he was basically just a proxy for Kolomoisky. But there's been efforts by the government to kind of go after various forms of corruption that are linked to Kolomoisky over the past year. Mm-hmm. So that seems less and less likely. And most recently, he was detained over efforts to move money out of Ukraine. Because there's a lot of capital controls and whatnot to try to keep as much, foreign currency and money and whatnot in Ukraine as possible so that it can be used for the war effort. So that does present some evidence, not necessarily conclusive evidence, but some evidence that Zelensky is a truly independent political actor and not a proxy for some other powerful figures in Ukraine's political economy. Mm-hmm. Which is good in so much as corruption in Ukraine has been an issue. Certainly, it's one that's been brought up by critics of foreign support to Ukraine. So that is a little bit of countervailing evidence there that can be brought to bear.
So potentially good news.
Yeah.
Did you get a chance to read through the chat from last stream?
Yeah, I did. I appreciated the feedback. It's always cool hearing from people in Ukraine.
Yeah, that's the person I was referring to, who was kind of giving their opinion on Zelensky. I think they were not as in favor of Zelensky pre-war, and then post-war they feel like he's been doing a reasonably good job.
Yeah, that's kind of the impression I've gotten.
Yeah.
And from other people, so that definitely jibes with what I kind of already thought I knew.
Yeah, we've talked about that some just in the general context of different types of leadership and how certain leadership types can be better for certain circumstances or others. Like Winston Churchill is an example that we've had of a very, very hawkish and aggressive leader who was a good fit for a world war president, but if you're like a peacetime president, it might be a little bit too aggro.
Yeah, that's the issue. After the war was over, there was a shift in sentiment. Mm-hmm. People were ready for somebody who was less gung-ho. Mm-hmm. Yeah, what was his name? Attlee? He was the Labour prime minister that succeeded Churchill. Clement Attlee, yeah. 1945. Yeah, he's the guy that created the, whatchamacallit, the health service in the UK. Mm-hmm. That was when it was nationalized under his leadership.
Nice.
That's going to bug me. What is that called in the UK?
Their healthcare system or whatever they have?
Yeah. They had a specific name for it, and it's slipping my mind, and it's driving me crazy. NHS, that's what it was. Thank you. National Health Service. Yeah, that's been in the news a lot in the UK over the past 10 years. All of the austerity that the UK government has been doing over the past 10 years has resulted in budget cuts in the NHS. And so there's been issues with services. Although there's been issues with services for a while that predate austerity, but austerity didn't help.
Hmm.
And then Brexit didn't really help with the nursing shortage either, so that's been a problem too more recently.
Why were there nurses that were coming into Britain from outside the country?
Oh yeah, oh yeah. The wages are not great and the working conditions are very difficult, so there's not a lot of takers in Britain.
Hmm.
So historically, they've filled out a lot of their nursing needs with immigrants of one kind or another. But since Brexit, that process has been complicated and numbers have fallen off. And there has not been a ready supply of British made nurses to replace them. So nursing staffs have been getting squeezed correspondingly ever since. Yeah, successive governments have taken different approaches to resolving it. I think more recently they were talking about setting up an apprenticeship program, lowering the amount of time it takes to train nurses, increasing pay marginally, not
Hmm.
really enough, but marginally. Yeah, just little things here and there that are probably not going to be sufficient to really address the problem. The British government just doesn't really have the resources to throw money at the problem like the United States would probably do in similar circumstances.
Hmm.
And so that kind of puts them in a difficult position.
I would guess that one of the issues with the British economy in general is their cost of living per their wages. Seems like it's pretty rough. Like, why would you move to Britain to work? It seems like, yeah, they might pay you more than the country that you're from, but to stay there is also way more expensive.
You can live cheap, you can make it work.
Hmm.
It's just a matter of planning it out. You can kind of triple up or quadruple up in terms of roommates in very small apartments and save money that way. And there's different things. People can make it work. There's definitely people that would come if they could.
Hmm.
You can make pretty good money there, even if you end up spending most of your money on cost of living. The amount of money that you can save and send back home will more than justify it,
Hmm.
even still, just because cost of living is so much lower in a lot of developing countries. Even just being able to send a couple $100s back makes a huge difference if you're living in a place where most people live on $1 a day.
Hmm.
So there's still good incentive to go. It's just that the British government has kind of restricted access to the market. They made it more difficult to migrate to Britain legally, anyway, and work as a nurse there.
Hmm.
And so therein lay the real issue.
Someone asked before we got started, I think Britain is in this, that there are some countries joining Brics in January.
Yeah, that is correct.
What are those countries? And as a refresher, what is Brics?
Um, BRICS doesn't really stand for anything. It just means, what is it? The B stands for Brazil, the R is Russia, the I is India, the C is China, and then the S is South Africa. And it's an increasingly archaic term because originally it was actually a term created by, I think, an investment fund manager way back around like 2005, 2006. This was back when the international economy was doing very well and where commodity prices in particular were relatively high, much to the benefit of developing countries, which tend to have economies that are disproportionately dependent on the export of commodities. And so a number of commodity driven economies were doing so strong that it was thought that their economies would inevitably kind of emerge into at least regional powers, if not collectively representing a new kind of global pole in the world order. And so this investment fund manager referred to the strongest and fastest growing countries in that cohort of well performing developing countries as the BRICS, referring specifically to Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. And he didn't really have a political forecast in mind. He wasn't saying that they would all cooperate and create a new world order, but when he started talking about them as a kind of a group, there was some sense that, in so much as they had international objectives in common, that they might start working together in pursuit of those common objectives. And that led to those countries eventually meeting in what was basically a Brics summit. And since then, they have made varying, attempts of varying intensity over time to try to institutionalize the Brics relationship. So they have created a sort of a forum that meets regularly, as well as a Brics bank, which is basically an investment bank akin to, the World Bank or the IMF, which lends to either member states and sometimes to also other countries as well. And, the idea roughly is to create some kind of international architecture that could challenge, if not replace, the international architecture in the form of like the UN, the World Bank, et cetera, that was created by the West, and which is broadly seen in the developing world as tools of the West in order to pursue their self-interest. So Brics, as a rough organization, and it is kind of a very loose organization, has grown over time. And more recently, over the past 5 some years, there's been growing interest by other countries not traditionally associated with Brics in joining the organization, in so much as you can call it an organization. And so there have been new members who have been applying, and some of which have even been accepted. So that's roughly what Brics is. It's basically just a loose confederation of states that basically have very little in common beyond the fact that they're all developing countries that do not feel they have sufficient voice in international institutions that are, as of now, largely dominated by Western countries. So who's joining Brics? Argentina is one of them. Iran is another one. Pakistan, I think, has already joined, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, I'm having to look it up because I don't know them off the top of my head. Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Ethiopia. Oh, the UAE. That was also another notable one. So yeah, a couple Middle Eastern states, and then Argentina, and then Ethiopia. Those are pretty much the 6 that are joining recently. I'm pretty sure Pakistan had joined earlier. There's probably a couple other states that I can't remember, but yeah, that's where we are. Saudi Arabia in particular was considered a big notable pickup for Brics, since Saudi Arabia has traditionally been pretty strongly aligned in terms of foreign policy with the United States. And also, of course, Saudi Arabia has just bucket loads of money, so that's helpful as well.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's kind of been in the news. Some people have been talking about that and how the Brics might become some kind of future alternative pole in global politics. But in my opinion, it's way oversold, which is why I haven't really talked about it much. All of the countries involved have issues with each other to varying degrees. And so their ability to cooperate, indeed their willingness to cooperate, is relatively limited. They do have some stuff in common in so much as they want a greater voice in international affairs, but that's about it. And altogether, their collective influence is probably not sufficient to really change things overall. Really, the only country that has enough heft to really challenge the West is China. And in so much as that's the case, China is disproportionately important within Brics. Brics basically at this point is a Chinese-sponsored organization. It's not really a meeting of equals at this point. And in so much as Brics has money to spend in order to exert influence, almost all of it is Chinese money. The Brics Bank is largely funded by China. The other participants do not really have that much money to contribute in the first place. And the amount they contribute kind of reflects that, as I understand it. So, the fact that they're getting new applicants doesn't really mean much. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, those are notable new members in so much as they actually have money that they could put up that could be used to exert influence. But Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Argentina, these are not countries known for having strong economies. So, this is like having an organization that you hope will become the next big thing, the next bank that could challenge Goldman Sachs. But then all of your new business partners are beggars on the street. It's probably not going to significantly add to the capacity of your organization. So Brics is not really a significant competitor at this point. In so much as it's largely just a proxy for China.
That makes sense. And it's nothing that's as closely linked as an organization that at least has a geographical commonality, like the EU. At least there's a reason for them to think about their borders being more open and trade and kind of travel between them, as opposed to Brics, which is countries all over the world, and they have pretty major cultural differences as well, so they're not quite as united as in purpose as an organization like NATO might be. I know NATO's a different purpose than Brics, but
Yeah,
there's,
same idea.
yeah, not as many
Yeah,
commonalities between Brics nations.
Yeah, NATO has a lot of institutional, coherence. It has a very specific mission, and they have a lot of practice in preparing for that mission. And even if NATO doesn't necessarily do a whole lot, when they do something, they do it purposely in a way that's very well organized and is in general pretty effective. Brics doesn't have that. It doesn't have any particular purpose. It doesn't have any institutional coherence that can be leveraged into broader influence. Brics is more of an idea than it is a real going concern unto itself. And as a result, it has a very limited ability to influence international outcomes.
Good to know. Speaking of organizations gaining members, chat's asking about an update on Sweden joining NATO. Why or why not?
There's been progress. Let me see. I have notes on this, actually, that I haven't been able to get to in a while, so we can knock this out. But yeah, in general, the trajectory is very positive. The Turkish government has come around and has been sending signals that it's going to change its tune and actually kind of vote to allow Sweden to join. But as much talk as there's been about that, there's been even more delays. So it's not really clear when exactly they'll hold that vote or even if they'll do it. And there's been intervening events since that announcement was made that could complicate things. So the update here is that Sweden had a change of government over the past year. They'd had a sort of center-left government. Now they have a right-wing government. And the new right-wing government has been much more willing to indulge requests by the Turkish government to make changes vis-a-vis Sweden's policy on refugees, Kurds, etc. So specifically, oh, wait a minute. This isn't the right set of... Well, anyway, they've been more willing to make adjustments and reforms and whatnot, including on counterterrorism, which had been one of the big things that the Turkish government had been asking about. Historically, Sweden had taken in a lot of refugees from the Middle East, including Kurds from Turkey. And some of those Kurds had links to radical organizations in Turkey, the PKK, I think also the YPG in a couple cases. And the Turkish government considers those organizations terrorist groups. And so the Turkish government had been asking Sweden to deport those people. I think ideally they would be extradited to Turkey, but I don't think that the Turkish government even expected that to happen. But they were asking for them to be expelled from Sweden, and also for Sweden to change its laws so people like that would not qualify for asylum in Sweden. There was also new laws passed in Sweden regarding punishment for financing of terrorism. So those have been, the ambit of those laws has been passed. And the Swedish government also arrested a Kurdish man under those new laws for allegedly trying to finance quote-unquote terrorism, probably involving the PKK. And that guy is set to be deported. Supposedly, the Swedish government also agreed to support Turkey's push to join the European Union. That's almost certainly not going anywhere. It's a nice gesture by the Swedish government, but nobody expects Turkey to be allowed into the European Union anytime soon, if ever. For those of you who maybe don't know the background of this, Turkey has been trying to get into the European Union for 30 years now, maybe around 25 years, something in that range. A very long time. And there was a time in the early aughts when it seemed like they were at least progressing in that direction. The European Union did kind of lay out a plan for them, and the Turkish government was nominally adhering to it, but events over the past 10 to 15 years have pretty much scuppered any real possibility of Turkey joining. Turkey is too authoritarian. at this point for that to be really feasible. And often on issues with terrorism and supposed links to the Turkish government, as well as the whole Kurdish issue, all of that greatly complicates talks about Turkey being let in. So, yes, they'll have Sweden's support, but that support is largely going to be nominal. It's going to be largely lip service.
Why do they want to join the EU?
I mean, just have access to the single market. It would open up opportunities for the Turkish economy. So, it would be a net positive in that sense. Also, it would give, the Turkish government a vote in the European Union affairs, which I'm sure that they would use in a totally responsible, not exploitative way. But yeah, they definitely have good reason to want in, if only because of the single market. But there's lots of prerequisites that would have to be met, especially regarding human rights issues and democracy, that the current Turkish government does not find all that interesting. And so as a result, talks have been stalled for more than 2 decades now. So let's see. Sweden made these concessions. The Turkish government was very pleased, and President Erdogan and the AKP signaled that they would be willing to vote to allow Sweden to join later, in a couple months. They kind of have their own timetable in Turkey. It's also thought that the U.S. probably played a role in these negotiations between Sweden and Turkey. Around the time all of these concessions by Sweden were announced, the U.S. also announced that it was going to remove blocks to Turkey buying the F-35, which is an advanced jet that Turkey and the United States, among many other countries, developed together way back when, but which Turkey has been blocked from buying as a result of the whole Russian surface-to-air missile system issue that erupted during the Trump administration. So the blocks on Turkish purchase of those fighters has now been removed. The U.S. government was a bit cagey as to the exact circumstances around its decision to remove those blocks, but it almost certainly has to do with Sweden. Mm-hmm. There doesn't really seem to be anything else happening right now that would really justify a change in policy in that way. So everything's looking good, but people in Sweden just cannot stop burning Korans. It keeps happening. And the fallout from that has actually extended beyond Turkey. In one of the recent Koran burnings, protesters in Iraq actually stormed Sweden's embassy in Baghdad. And also the Iraqi government even expelled Sweden's envoy. So, people in the Middle East in general not very happy about all of the Koran burnings that have been happening. And the Turkish government has not explicitly said that they're going to refuse to allow Sweden to join NATO if these burnings continue. But they have said that they don't like it and that they wish Sweden would do something about it.
Do they know, kind of, in the Muslim world, that they're not special and that they did this with Christianity like 10, 15 years ago? With the black metal scene?
Do they know?
Yeah.
The question of do they know is different than the question of do they care.
Well, yeah. They burned churches and stuff in Sweden and Norway in the 90s. Like, this is what they do. It's like...
Well, Christianity and the Christian God are not the one true faith, so why does that matter?
Well, Christians think so.
Well, tell it to the Muslim world. I'm sure they'll care greatly about the argumentation
Dear
there.
Muslim world, people in Scandinavia burn religious stuff. It's one of their traditions, so please respect their tradition.
Good luck with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really not so much a issue of the Muslim world, being angry about supposed affronts to their religion, although that's obviously part of it. The bigger issue is a political issue. Mm-hmm. The suspicion is that various interested parties, you can probably guess who, have been, if not encouraging these Koran burnings in Sweden, are certainly amplifying them on social media and ensuring that the Muslim world is exposed to it to a degree that they would not have been otherwise, in order to inflame opinion in the region. Mm. And of course, the main suspicious actor there is Russia, because of course Russia does not want Sweden to join NATO. Mm-hmm. So the suspicion is that they're kind of going out of their way to try to trump up these tensions in order to try to get Turkey to refuse to allow Sweden to join. Now, that's conjecture. Nobody knows for sure whether or not that's the case. Certainly, there have been Karen burnings well before recent tensions over Ukraine, so that's not new. But it is very convenient that suddenly this is a big issue where it was not really before. So basically, that's where we are. It's not really clear as of yet just to what degree the Turkish government is going to feel pressure from its public about the burnings, or if the trade-off that was made with the US government and with the Swedish government is going to be sufficient to sway them to actually allow Sweden to join. The prophesied vote that is supposed to happen in the Turkish legislature has as of yet been happened, and I don't think it's even yet really been organized. Supposedly, they were going to do it by the end of the year, but who knows? So the drama is as of yet not concluded. So watch this space. We shall see just what happens. It's certainly been a much more torturous path for Sweden to join NATO than was expected. I remember back in mid-2022, people were expecting them to join in a matter of months. Obviously, things did not pan out that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, Finland was able to get in. Turkey didn't have a problem with Finland, so they were able to join pretty readily. And given that Finland's the one with the actual border with Russia, that was probably the more strategically substantive admission.
Yeah, true.
So Sweden not getting in yet is not too big a deal in the grand scheme of things.
It does seem weird that they would get stuck on a symbolic gesture like that, but it does matter when you're trying to keep your base happy, because that's something that does piss off the religious folk.
Yeah, President Erdogan and his party, the AKP, predicated a good chunk of their legitimacy and popularity on conservative values.
Mm-hmm.
Not necessarily Islamism per se, although there are definitely Islamists in the party, but yeah, conservatism is a big part of the party's appeal. It's also a very pro-business party. So a lot in common with the Republican Party here in the US, in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
Socially conservative, pro-free market.
Just a different religious flavor.
Oh, yeah. Was there any other drama we wanted to get to?
Just double checking the notes I took real quick. There was a military coup in West Africa.
Oh, Gabon, yeah. There was a coup there. Yeah, that's not going to be nearly... That coup is not going to get nearly as much attention as the coup in Niger. Gabon has been authoritarian for decades. It did not have anything resembling even a nominal democracy like Niger did until recently. So, changing from a kleptocratic authoritarian government to a military junta is pretty much a lateral move for Gabon.
Mm-hmm.
Potential for upside, it's always possible the new leadership is going to go less hard, maybe open up the politics, liberalize a little bit, but nobody expects that.
Mm-hmm.
Gabon's trouble is that it's a major oil producer. It generates a lot of oil revenue. So anybody in charge of Gabon can basically become an instant billionaire very quickly. So the temptation is great, and the restraints and disincentives to seizing power and enjoying that wealth are very limited. So however unpopular the de facto royal family had been, they didn't actually have a royal family, but there was one family that had ruled Gabon for more than 40 years, which had still been in control of it up until the coup. So that family was very unpopular. And the recent election in which they very obviously rigged the vote did them no favors. And it seems that the election was sort of the straw that broke the camel's back. The military, for whatever reason, decided that this particular rigged election was the one that they would use to justify a seizure of power.
Mm-hmm.
but probably more likely they were taking note of French inaction in the face of coups in the rest of West Africa. Generally, when there was a coup, the French would kind of intervene, historically speaking, in the Cold War. But since then, they've gotten less and less interested with political affairs in West Africa, and ambitious actors of one sort or another have taken note and have increasingly acted upon French disinterest in order to seize power for themselves. So Gabon is just the latest example of that. But like I said, Gabon was a major oil producer and it always had an authoritarian government. So most likely this is going to be a lateral move where there's just new management running a new authoritarian government. There's just too much oil money at stake to really disincentivize it, to prevent it from happening like that. I'm happy to be proven wrong, but in all likelihood, that's what it's going to look like. On the plus side, there's not likely to be much involvement of Wagner Group or Russia, since Russia has gotten increasingly involved with coups and other governments of that sort in Africa. There's no insurgency in Gabon. There's no ongoing civil war that would justify the hiring of Wagner Group mercenaries of one kind or another. So in all likelihood, Gabon will maintain its previous foreign policy. Again, change in management, but very little else. That's the expected outcome right now. Also, the West doesn't have any air bases in Gabon like they do in the Sahel. So like Chad and Niger, for example. So there's no strategic imperative there either that might compel the West to get interested to a degree it would not otherwise. Also, Gabon is not a member of ECOWAS. ECOWAS is the international organization in West Africa that has been trying to discourage coups from happening by backing civilian governments in the region. But Gabon's not a member, so there's no imperative there for ECOWAS to get involved. So all in all, for all of the drama there's been over Niger and other coups in the Sahel, there's probably not going to be any attention paid to Gabon. This is more just business as usual for that particular region of Africa. And that's how it's likely to be treated by various foreign actors.
I just pulled up the map here real quick because I needed to refresh about where Gabon is. But DPRK is right here, or DPRC. Democratic Republic of Congo is kind of in the middle, and then Republic of Congo to the west of that, and then Gabon to the west of that at the coast here. Equatorial Guinea is just north of it and south of it.
Yeah, the coastal region in that area is very rich in oil resources. So all of those countries, Angola, Gabon, Nigeria, Cameroon, all of them produce good amounts of oil and generate a lot of government revenue from oil.
Cool. Yeah, not as familiar with a lot of these countries.
Well, a lot of them have been pretty quiet. If you were in the Francophone world, you would be more familiar. Pretty much all of them are French-speaking countries and have been subject to significant amounts of French influence over time, up until maybe a couple decades ago. So, yeah, they're just sort of quiet, out-of-the-way places for the most part. There's not a lot of civil wars that happen in and around that central area. Cameroon, Gabon, Republic of Congo, very, very rarely in the news. It's not to say they don't have their problems. It's just their problems don't impact other countries to a significant enough degree for those problems to be well publicized internationally.
I do remember when I was visiting France that the Côte d'Ivoire French accent is super cool. It's kind of more like a relaxed and chill way of speaking French. Not quite as fancy, you could say, but it does sound more friendly than a lot of French speakers might come across to you.
Huh. No, I didn't know that. That's pretty interesting.
Fun travel tip for people going to France is whenever you go into a new area, try to say hello in French at least first and then ask them if they can speak English. Things will go way better than if you just walk up to them and then speak English and expect them to understand. Sometimes it'll be fine, but sometimes they'll be offended that you expect them to speak your language there. Depends on how touristy the area is, of course. But if you try to speak French and you fumble, they think you're cute. If you speak English at them, they might think you're rude. I think the phrase that I learned from a Côte d'Ivoire person was "Comment tu vas?" I think that's like a cool way of saying like "What's up?"
It's been a long time since I've studied French.
It's an awesome language. I think one of the coolest sounding ones.
Always had a tin ear, so it's been kind of rough to learn new languages.
Yeah, French has a bunch of weird sounds to it. Chinese, though, seems super hard because it's a tonal language. And you can have a word that's the same rough sound, but the tones for each of the different parts of it can change so much. And being able to do all of those seems like a very foreign thing to an English speaker.
Yeah, I do decent when it comes to the unique sounds in the Chinese language, and when it comes to tones, I just cannot get it. I've tried many times, and I've even had help from Chinese friends trying to help me learn, but man, for whatever reason, I just can't quite get it right.
Chat says Vietnamese is more difficult. Sure. Actually, chat, just tell us what your opinion for the most difficult languages, because I haven't tried to do all of them. So it's very possible that there might be a secret hidden language that's super duper hard.
Yeah, East Asian languages are generally ranked as the most difficult.
Romance languages, I think, are some of the easiest, just because they tend to follow their own rules better than some languages. Like Germanic languages, I think, have more exceptions that you just have to memorize. Doesn't necessarily make it difficult. It just means there's more brute force memorization of, oh, that's an exception to this normal rule. Spanish is a very nice language for how it's organized, and it doesn't seem quite as hard for the pronunciation as French, at least for an English speaker. Some people in chat are saying Polish. Romanian is apparently pretty hard. I've heard Finnish is pretty weird too.
Hindi isn't too bad. It's actually surprisingly similar to Western languages.
Mm-hmm.
It's in the same language family, so it makes sense. Indo-European.
Mm-hmm.
The Dravidic languages, though, are different. That's a different language tree entirely, so that's a bit more difficult.
What are those?
Those are the languages in southern India. Hindi is very much a northern India language. That whole northern half of India is largely part of a Hindustani belt, basically a dialect continuum of Hindi dialects of one kind or another. One of them in particular is basically the root of modern Hindi, that being the dialect in and around New Delhi. I think it was called like Kaj Bajoli or something like that. I don't remember exactly. But that was the court language in the Islamic empires, specifically the Mughal Empire, over the course of the 1500s or so. It was originally heavily influenced by Persian and Turkish as well. And it was called Urdu originally. But then Indian nationalists who were fighting for an independent India in the late 19th century, early 20th century, they wanted to have a purely Indian language that would be the nation's official language. And so they didn't want to use Urdu, even though that was kind of a logical choice since it had been the lingua franca in India for a long time. They didn't want to use that because it had so many foreign loanwords from Persian and Turkish. And so they actually took Urdu and they stripped out all of those Turkish and Persian words and replaced them with new Sanskritized words. Basically they took whatever those foreign words were describing and created words out of whole cloth using Sanskrit. Sanskrit is the ancient language of India. It's the root language for a lot of modern languages across the country. So it would be kind of like taking out foreign loan words in English and replacing them all with new words that you created out of Latin.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea, again, there was to create a purely indigenous national language for India. And that's actually how Hindi was created. It's actually a very new language in that sense. It's basically a heavily modified form of Urdu. So all of that, I guess that was a tangent. To bring this full circle, Urdu and Hindi are all basically a part of the same broader family of Hindi dialect languages in northern India. And they're all pretty closely related. Mutual intelligibility can range pretty wildly. In general, the closer geographic proximity to a given dialect that another dialect is, the more likely they are to be mutual intelligible. Pretty intuitive. Once you get into sort of more fringe parts of the dialect continuum, like Gujarati, for example, or Rajput, those are not really mutually intelligible for the most part with Hindi, even though they're all still related. So that's northern India. Southern India has totally different tradition. They've got a Dravidic language, or more accurately, they have a number of languages in the region that are all collectively part of the Dravidic family. And those languages are ancient. Those are languages like Tamil and whatnot that go back thousands of years. There's even ancient Tamil literature that goes back thousands of years. It's a very old culture. And it kind of evolved separately, at least initially, from civilizations that emerged in the north of India, like the, what would you call it, the Indus River Valley civilization, and also the Magadhi civilization, sort of in the eastern Gangetic range, closer to where Bengal is now. Originally, the Dravidic civilization in the south was separate, and so they developed their own language. And it's not really related at all to the Indo-European family tree. There are loan words. They have taken a lot of loan words just because of cultural interchange with the north of India over the course of thousands of years. So there's a lot of commonalities now. But the basic structure of the language is very different. So that's what I mean when I say that, Dravidic is a different animal. It's a totally different class of languages in the south of India that they have.
Mm-hmm.
That's a big part of the cultural identity of South India. The fact that they have a different language, that they have their own writing system, that they have their own literature that goes back thousands of years. That's a big part of their unique identity. And it's part of the reason that native regional parties do so strong in southern India. Originally, the Indian National Congress had basically just won all of the offices in India, regardless of region. But the regionalist, the strong independent identity of certain regions eventually evolved into strong regional parties that were able to successfully win office in those regions. And Tamil Nadu in the south of India was probably the most prominent example of that from a relatively early stage even. It took a couple decades for regional parties in India to really take off, but in the case of Tamil Nadu, they actually had theirs as early as the 1960s, just 20 years or so after independence. Anyway, wild tangent. Yeah, Hindi is relatively easy to learn. Dravidic languages in the south, much more difficult in general.
There are also people in the chat saying that Welsh is the hardest.
Yeah, some of those old Celtic languages are pretty weird. Certainly, I find the spelling incomprehensible.
Yeah, I've seen pictures of the different road signs and stuff in Wales.
Yeah.
Pretty funny names.
I cannot decipher them. Must be some interesting transliteration rules over there.
Or they have no rules.
Certainly can feel like it sometimes.
Well, those are all the questions that I had from the chat from before we started.
Fair enough. Did we have any new ones since then?
I don't think so. Chat, you can tag me if you had one that we didn't get to yet.
Let's see. Gonna try to find the Smith thing. It always kind of gets lost in the column here. Oh, there it is. Okay. Well, if we don't have anything else we can get to, I've always got Ukraine updates. And there's stuff we can talk about vis-a-vis China as well, which we've been putting off for a while. So it could be good to get that knocked out.
Yeah, send it.
All right. Which would you prefer, Ukraine or China?
Let's do China.
China, okay. Well, let's see. A couple items here. As far as the Central Pacific, there's been ongoing concern in the West, and the United States in particular, about Chinese influence in certain Central Pacific states, especially those that the United States has compacts of free association with. These are deals that basically give the United States responsibility for the defense as well as the general foreign policy of these countries. In exchange, these countries are granted privileges with regard to access to the United States, both in terms of the US market and in terms of the freedom to travel to the United States. So basically, if your country is in a compact of free association with the US, you can pretty much freely travel to and work in the United States as you please, despite the fact that you are not actually despite the fact that your country is not actually a legal territory of the United States. So basically, you get to be Puerto Rico without the detriments of being Puerto Rico. Not a bad deal overall, but you do have to give up your foreign policy. You're not going to be able to make deals with, say, China or whatever on your own. The United States kind of has these countries locked down geopolitically. The issue, though, is that these compacts of free association are not permanent. They did have expiration dates, and it just so happens that these expirations have been pending over the past year or two, and so there's been a big rush by the United States to renegotiate them, and there's renewed impetus to do so because there's been sudden pressure from China in the region as far as influence operations over the past couple years in particular, that has brought new focus on the region as a sort of area of competition between the United States and China. That, of course, famously started, I want to say 2 years ago, with the deal between China and the Solomon Islands, which regarded potential deployment of Chinese police to the Solomon Islands in the event of some kind of emergency, as well as possible access to Solomon Islands ports for the Chinese Navy. So, the Solomon Islands said that it wasn't that big a deal, and, we're not giving them like basing rights, but of course, geopolitical competition is all about professional paranoia. So those entreaties did not really do much to assuage opinion in Western governments, certainly not in Washington. So there's been a big push to try to reestablish strong relations with nations in the region and to try to get the money spigot going again, as far as things like aid, support, loans, things like that. So some of this shift has borne fruit. New association deals have been signed between the United States and Micronesia, as well as with Palau. So that's 2 out of the 3 that we had such agreements with. The Marshall Islands is the other one. Negotiations with the Marshall Islands are still ongoing, so it remains to be seen whether or not those will pan out. But thus far, 2 out of 3 ain't bad. Micronesia, Palau, pretty good pickups in that sense. Marshall Islands would be nice, just because those islands in particular are actually east of the Marianas. If you don't know where the Marianas are, that's basically where Guam is. So Guam is its own territory. The Northern Mariana Islands is actually a separate territory that also belongs to the United States. That's kind of lesser known than Guam, but both of them are almost to the immediate west of the Marshall Islands. So it would be nice from a strategic perspective for the United States to be able to ensure that the space to the east of the Marianas is not potentially mercenary in nature. That is to say, potentially subject to Chinese influence and potentially subject to a flipping diplomatically to a Chinese alignment. So there's going to be a lot of pressure there on the Marshall Islands to try to sign that deal. And I'm sure Washington is going to bring lots of money and other concessions to try to get them on board. But for now, those negotiations are ongoing. Also, going to the South Pacific, the latest drama there regards Vanuatu. There was a minor political crisis that erupted when the president of Vanuatu lost a vote of no confidence. He, however, did not want to step down, and so the case ended up going before the Supreme Court, which ruled that the vote of no confidence should be respected. And it's not clear whether or not that's going to happen, but regardless, it was noted that the Vanuatu government invited Chinese police to Vanuatu to help deal with unrest, because obviously significant protests ended up breaking out corresponding with the political crisis. And so Chinese police dutifully were deployed by the Chinese government in response to the request. And that raised a lot of eyebrows, in the West, which had not really thought of Vanuatu as especially pro-Chinese. Certainly, China has spent a lot of money in Vanuatu as part of the Belt and Road Program. They pretty much spent a lot of money everywhere as part of the Belt and Road Program. But Vanuatu was not thought to be particularly subject to Chinese influence, but some of that opinion is now being revised in light of recent events. Now, to be fair to Vanuatu, the Chinese police in question did not actually really do anything. From what I was reading, it sounded like the only thing of substance they did was hand out uniforms to the Vanuatu police, which is not that big a deal in the grand scheme of things. So, if that's all the Chinese police do there, probably not a lot to worry about. But even so, the optics are not great.
Are they really nice uniforms or like kind of normal?
The article in question did not specify the quality of the uniforms that were distributed.
They distributed uniforms and they were of the highest quality. Oh, okay.
Yeah, I couldn't tell you. But regardless, that did get Vanuatu in the news, at least within national security circles. So you could see more of an effort by Washington to spend some money in Vanuatu somehow, among other things. It's not all about money. Sometimes it's about access. Having easier visa requirements, making it as easier for example, for students and countries in the region to travel to the United States, or for people to travel from the United States and invest in these countries, or for people in these countries to get money into the United States. That's all stuff more in the regulatory realm, which the United States could offer as concessions. So you'll probably see a lot of that going forward in the region, and with Vanuatu in particular. So let's see, that's a Pacific update. There's also been renewed diplomatic efforts that haven't really gone anywhere, but they are talking. You may remember that there was going to be talks between Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, and the Chinese government. But that trip had to be canceled because of all of the balloon drama, which I'm sure you remember from earlier this year.
Oh, yeah, we were very aggressively accosted by a weather balloon. The spy weather balloon slowly floating above our country and looking at everything we were doing.
Yeah, the diplomatic kerfuffle that resulted ended up delaying diplomatic re-engagement between China and the United States for some months. But since the summer, they've started going forward with those plans again. So Janet Yellen, Secretary of the Treasury, she traveled to China talking about the tall fence, small yard. I don't know. Have you heard that phrase before?
No, but that sounds like a heavy fortification for a not large place.
Well, more specifically, it's a policy. The idea being that the United States does not want to cut off all trade with China, but does want to substantively block economic engagement with regard to certain key strategic technologies. So tall fence, small yard refers to the tall fence. The tall fence refers to strong restrictions on U.S. investment in certain key technologies, as well as strong export controls on key technologies into China. The small yard refers to these restrictions being limited to very specific areas while allowing the broader economy and trade with China to go unmolested. So tall fence, small yard. That's the term that they've used to describe this approach to managing economic relations with China. So Janet Yellen went to China and really emphasized that, even if we're kind of going hard on certain technologies, we still want to engage economically with China and to manage competition with China, quote unquote, responsibly. That's another term that comes up a lot. So that was summer. In August, Secretary of Commerce Raimondo went to China. She's been talking trade, tourism, nothing to show for it, no surprise. There was also a meeting in June in Singapore between representatives of varying stripes across the administrative agencies of China and the United States. This particular meeting also involved Chinese and American defense ministers, notably, as well as intelligence chiefs. So obviously, the emphasis of that meeting in Singapore was national security matters. There hasn't been a lot of talk about what came out of the meeting, but given that it's national security, that's not surprising. We probably won't know about any agreements that have been made there for some time. There may not have even been any agreements. Probably a lot of it was more about trying to establish lines of communication so that if a crisis happens, they can easily talk to each other and know who to call. Also, there was probably just a general exchange of views and opinions about the national security environment in places like the South China Sea and Taiwan, which have been of interest over the past 10 to 20 years. So lots of diplomacy, lots of talking. That's what you want to see in order to try to smooth over differences and try to reach some kind of mutual understanding that could form the foundation for more formal agreements managing relations. So talk like this generally doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't look sexy. It gets reported and people get bored and don't pay attention. That's totally understandable. This is not really super substantive stuff right now, but it's also important in so much as it's a necessary prerequisite to get to substantive diplomacy. You can't have substantive diplomacy without a lot of boring preliminary work establishing the groundwork for it, and that's what's happening right now. So maybe nothing substantive ever comes out of this. It's never any guarantee that trying to build agreements and relations and groundwork and whatnot actually goes anywhere, but it is at least happening now, and that itself is a positive trend. So let's see, speaking of export restrictions, the United States obviously passed a bunch, but the United States by itself is insufficient. That is to say, the United States implementing export restrictions by itself is not going to be sufficient to substantively pressure China's technological development. Other countries that are also technological leaders in the global economy will also have to participate in export restrictions in order to really make them work. So the United States government over the past year has been trying to convince other key countries, particularly those relevant to the supply chain of the semiconductor industry, to participate in export control regimes created by the United States. And so there was actually a success on this count. A couple months ago, the Dutch government, that is to say the government of the Netherlands, actually did agree to restrict the export of, quote unquote, certain advanced semiconductor manufacturing equipment, end quote. And so that's important because the Netherlands is a major producer of the most advanced manufacturing equipment used to make the most advanced semiconductor chips. So, if you block off the export of advanced semiconductor chips to China, that's great. But if China can still build the equipment, can still buy the equipment that is used to make those chips, you haven't really accomplished anything, because then they can just start making the chips themselves. So there's a big effort by the American government to try to get the Dutch on board. It seems like they've succeeded. So that avenue to advanced chips production is, for the moment, blocked off for the Chinese government. And there's also been efforts in similar vein with regard to South Korea and Japan. Those have also borne fruit. So the major players in the semiconductor industry are largely on board with export restrictions. There are still some other countries that the U.S. is going to push to get on board. Broadly, they would like as many countries as possible, since that would limit the possibilities for re-export. Since even if your country has export restrictions, it's possible for China to order the equipment from a third-party country that is not subject to export restrictions like that, and then get the equipment or supplies that they want that way. Russia does a lot of that to circumvent sanctions to get war materials for its economy. So China could and most likely has been doing that ever since export restrictions and various sanctions have been applied to it over the past 5 to 10 years. Germany, I think in particular, will be a target because as I understand it, and I think as somebody in chat pointed out once, Germany does not itself produce a lot of semiconductor chips. I should say semiconductor. Germany itself does not produce a lot of semiconductors or other microchips and whatnot, nor does it produce a lot of the equipment that is used to make semiconductors. However, there are a lot of German companies that produce inputs, that is to say, parts that are used to make the equipment that is used to make semiconductors. And in so much as that's the case, there is a desire to try to ensure that China doesn't buy all of the parts that are used to make advanced manufacturing equipment and then just build the equipment that way, and then in that manner achieve the capacity to produce advanced semiconductors. So Germany hasn't really done that as of yet, and so that will likely be a future endeavor for Washington diplomatically. We'll see how that goes. So let's see, I did have also an update on Canada as far as China. I don't think it's really been reported a whole lot outside of Canada, but there has been a lot of China drama in Canada over the past year or so. So
Regarding
for one,
housing or what?
well, a couple of things. For one, there have been allegations of election interference. There were leaks to the Canadian media suggesting that intelligence agencies in Canada had concluded that China had attempted to meddle in federal elections, specifically the most recent federal elections in Canada. And so that had a lot of people talking. Also, there were accusations that China had intimidated a member of parliament named Michael Chong, and also that China had allegedly waged a disinformation campaign against this person, Michael Chong, on the messaging app WeChat, which of course is very popular in China. And Canada retaliated to those well, obviously the Canadian government thinks these allegations are true, and so they retaliated by expelling a diplomat from China named Zhao Wei. That happened over in May. So there's been some China drama in Canadian politics. I don't think it's been like anywhere near the leading issue in Canada, but since we're doing China updates, that's relevant. Mm-hmm. Now, China, for its part, did not let all of this go unpunished. Obviously, the Chinese government just denied everything. And so they retaliated, quote unquote, to these aggressions by Canada. For one, with an expulsion, they expelled Canada's diplomat, Jennifer Lynn Lalonde, who was working in Canada's Shanghai consulate. And also they excluded Canada from the recent partial lifting of COVID travel restrictions. Obviously, China had very strict travel restrictions related to COVID-19 and the pandemic. They had not lifted them until recently, maybe a month or two ago. And when they announced that they were going to lift travel restrictions for travel groups, they haven't completely lifted the travel restrictions. What they're going to do is they're going to allow group tours into China, and only if they qualify and only if they're from certain specific countries. So Canada did not make the short list of countries from which group tours will be allowed into China. And so that was a problem because obviously, to China or to Canada, either way, I think. Regardless, tourism had been, not a significant driver of Canada's economy, but it brought in, I think, $1 billion or so Canadian dollars was the statistic I read. And so China very purposely excluded Canada from the list as a form of economic pressure.
$1 billion over how much time?
I think it was like $1 billion a year.
Wow. That's a lot more than I would expect.
Yeah, well, a lot of people go to China, and a lot of people from China go to Canada, obviously, to study or for investment purposes or whatever else. And plenty of people in Canada, well, maybe not plenty, but a number of people in Canada, especially those of Chinese descent, would travel to China. So it adds up. But yeah, China retaliated on those counts: the expulsion of the consulate representative, and then excluding China from the benefits of their partial relaxation of COVID travel restrictions.
I thought it was
Let's
going to be a
see.
mostly symbolic thing, canceling tourism, but $1 billion a year that's a bit of money.
Well, Canada's economy is about $1 trillion a year, so eh, it's decent money, but compared to the overall economy, not that much. Am I getting that right? Oh, 2 trillion. Okay. I fact checked myself. It's twice as much as I thought it was. Canada's GDP, $2 trillion. So well done, Canada. And I think that's actually higher than Russia's. Yeah. Russia is $1.7 trillion, 2021.
Oh, I didn't know that.
So Canada's economy is bigger than Russia's. Maybe keep that in mind when you're thinking about the economic cost of the Ukraine war.
Oh, true. That's a good point.
Yeah.
Should we be worried if Canada is going to try to go wreck a neighbor?
No.
You laugh, but
Yeah, I don't think Canada has the resources to do that. Actually, Mexico is in the same league. Yeah, Mexico's GDP is $1.2 trillion. So that's not that much smaller than Russia's $1.7 trillion. So, if you don't think Mexico has the economic capacity to prosecute a large scale, highly destructive conventional war against a well armed neighbor, you should not think that Russia would be able to do so either, because they actually have about the same size in terms of economy. Russia has the benefit of the Cold War, specifically surplus from the Cold War. So that's kind of given them a structural advantage that, say, Mexico or Canada does not enjoy. But in terms of just raw economic power, yeah, that's about what we're talking about when we're talking about Russia versus Ukraine.
so we should definitely be nice to Canada. Make sure they don't get on our bad side.
Well, let's see. A couple more items here on China, specifically regarding economic competition. So, as I've talked about before on here, China and the United States talk a lot about competition with each other and go pretty hard in terms of, well, they say that they're very worried about economic coercion. But in practice, neither country really seems to actually know how to operationalize competition. For China, all of the stuff that is generally cited as efforts by China to compete with the West, a lot of that is actually just part of China's industrial policy. It's not necessarily driven by a broader strategic objective of spreading Chinese influence at the expense of American influence in the world. For Beijing, the money is more important than the influence. So in that sense, there's not as much competition per se from Beijing internationally as a lot of the political rhetoric in the United States might suggest. But by the same token, in the United States government, there's a lot of talk about a desire to compete with China, but not a lot of actual activity, certainly not a lot of actual planning. For that matter, we really don't even have the entirety of the US-China economic relationship plotted out, such that we can know where all of these sensitive bottlenecks are in that relationship. If we were able to plot out all of the bottlenecks, we'd be able to prioritize them and create a coherent economic strategy vis-a-vis China and the issue with China that could form the basis for a coherent foreign policy. But we haven't done that. So we really don't necessarily know what we should be planning for. And the result of that fact is that U.S. competition with China is largely reactive. By and large, there's specific issues that are of concern, and occasionally there are new issues that crop up. But there's not an overarching plan, nor is there even an overarching understanding of the actual threat that China poses now or could pose in the future. There just hasn't been enough analysis on that yet. So there's a certain amount of cheap talk to talk about China as a threat to the United States. In general, it sounds right. There is logic and reason to that notion, but at the same time, it's kind of hollow when you try to break down the details. Certainly in terms of strategic planning, there's very little that you can point to in terms of coherent policy in Washington on the issue of China. So whenever there's any kind of substantive effort to actually operationalize a strategy vis-a-vis the US and China, it's worth noting. And the Biden administration has made more progress on that front than, say, the Trump administration, and certainly a lot more than previous administrations. The Trump administration definitely at least made an effort. Obviously they launched the trade war. But there was a lot of disagreement within the Trump administration about what the ultimate objective would be. In general, I can't remember specifically who was in which faction. There was Wilbur Ross and some of the other guys in the trade side of the administration's policymaking who disagreed with each other. But basically, it came down to one faction which wanted to improve market access to Chinese markets for American firms. For that group, all of the pressure the United States was putting on China was a means to that end. But their opposing faction argued not for improved access to Chinese markets, but for a cutoff in trade between the United States and China. They didn't believe there was any reason for the U.S. to continue with trading with China, and that doing so was only empowering a rival of China and undermining America's own economy. So disagreement within the Trump administration partly resulted, to a degree, in policy paralysis. There was a inability to really go anywhere once they'd started the trade war. There were lots of negotiations with China about what kind of trading relationship they wanted and what kinds of changes could be made. But by and large, China just kind of delayed the talks. And in so much as there was an agreement, it was a temporary agreement. The famous Phase 1 deal that was signed that was meant to kind of pave the way for future advancement. And it's worth mentioning, too, that all of the stuff agreed to in the Phase 1 deal was low-hanging fruit. It was the stuff that was basically not controversial. All of the hard stuff that they'd been negotiating was supposed to happen in a prospective Phase 2 agreement, which would happen after the 2020 election. Of course, the Trump administration lost the 2020 election, and so those talks never really happened. And the Biden administration has taken a different tact to negotiating with China on economic issues. Specifically, they have largely continued the status quo from the Trump years, but have been much more hawkish in terms of placing restrictions on trade. The Trump administration did oversee certain changes that limited trade. The emergence of CFIUS, for example, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. I don't remember exactly what the acronym stands for, but basically it's an oversight committee that regulates foreign investment generally into the United States. But the institution, CFIUS specifically, was reorganized and modernized to give it more power, specifically to stop Chinese investment in strategic sectors of the U.S. economy. So, the Trump administration did oversee changes like that. And there were a number of executive orders that were issued by Trump himself that were part of an effort to pressure China and certainly Chinese firms. But again, there was never an overarching plan to that. It was just part of a general pressure campaign that the Trump administration was hoping would result in concessions from Beijing. And that didn't really happen. So the Biden administration, rather than trying to get concessions out of the Chinese government, has instead kind of taken a very much a carrot and stick approach. And it's been more stick than carrot, definitely. The carrot is basically the prospect of normalizing relations. They have said that if there were substantive agreement on broader trade issues, they would be willing to remove all of the tariffs that have been placed by the Trump administration. So that is basically the only real carrot that's being dangled right now. But the sticks are multitudinous. They have been coming out and implementing a number of export restrictions and now outbound investment restrictions on trade with China that are designed to cripple very particular areas of China's economy, and specifically targeted advanced technologies. So the Biden administration talked a lot about that in 2021 when Biden first came to office, basically. But there wasn't a lot of movement on that. And in that sense, they kind of paralleled the Trump administration. Trump obviously wanted to go after China and deal with the outstanding trade issues with China. But it took him until mid 2018 or so, roughly, for that trade war with China to actually start. So about a year and a half, roughly, after Trump took office, and kind of saw a similar dynamic with the Biden administration. In 2021, nothing really happened. Whenever they were asked about it, they said that they were doing a whole of government review. Basically, they were looking at the issue from as many angles as possible, and trying to write up a general report in which they could come to some kind of conclusions, decisive conclusions about what could tangibly be done on the China issue. So that probably took longer than they were expecting, because that was basically their line, that they were studying the issue for well over a year until 2022 in October, when they passed export restrictions. Well, I shouldn't say pass. The executive doesn't pass things, but what the Biden administration did was issue new orders using legal presidential power. I think specifically from the Economic Emergency Act from back in the 70s, among other powers. The president has pretty wide discretion at this point when it comes to trade. Regardless, in October 2022, the Biden administration issued new orders restricting exports to China in certain specific technologies. Semiconductors were the main one. They did not restrict export of all semiconductors or all semiconductor-related technology like equipment and software and whatnot. Specifically, they only targeted advanced semiconductors, and more particularly, the most advanced semiconductors. So it was still actually legal to export advanced semiconductors to China after that order was issued. It was only the most cutting edge stuff that China had been locked out of. But there were lots of holes and stuff because, again, Taiwan, Japan were not participating. So that diplomatic side was still pending. Like I said earlier, they did follow up on that, but at the time, they had not done that yet.
Would it be possible for China to get those from a third party? Like, say, we sell those fancy semiconductors to someone and then China buys them from them?
So there are two answers to that. Answer one, yes. Re-export is a real problem when you're trying to curtail export of certain goods to a particular country. It's even more difficult now that we have a very large international economy. Trade is massive and the flows are very difficult to keep track of. There's so many goods and services flowing across borders that it's not too difficult to set up a shell corporation and to start operating in a third-party country and getting access to stuff that you're not supposed to get access to. Again, Russia is doing a lot of that right now in response to sanctions placed on them over the Ukraine conflict. In China's case, there are a number of shell companies that the Chinese have set up in places like Singapore, for example, in an effort to try to procure technologies that they cannot procure legally directly from the United States. And there's an ongoing cat and mouse game where the United States, and specifically the U.S. Treasury Department, is constantly releasing new lists of new entities. This is called the entity list. You may have heard of it before. They're constantly creating new lists of entities that Americans cannot trade with. And most of these are basically shell companies created by either actors related to China or Russia trying to evade various sanctions or export restrictions. So yes, you can get around them, but there's a caveat. Export restrictions, while they do allow for you to sell goods and services to third-party countries, for one, generally the U.S. government pressures partner countries to create oversight regimes to ensure that sensitive technologies do not get sold on to certain countries. Not every U.S. partner is willing or sometimes even able to set up those kinds of oversight regimes. But generally, Washington tries to match these kinds of export regimes with diplomatic pressure in that vein. And you kind of saw that with the diplomatic pressure that was brought against Japan, Taiwan, and the Netherlands to participate in the export restriction regime that Washington was trying to create. Now, again, a lot of countries just either don't or can't do that. But even in those cases, what happens is that buyers of sensitive technology and equipment are required to not sell that equipment on to third parties that are not that they're not supposed to sell them to. Basically,
Gotcha.
that Washington doesn't want them to sell to.
Some resale restrictions, like whenever you buy an item and it says not for individual resale, like you have to honor that. You can't sell that one candy bar if it was purchased as a bundle of 6.
Basically, yeah. I mean, it's a licensing regime that was set up by the Commerce Department and is overseen by the, I think it's the Bureau of, no, BIS. I forget what the acronym stands for, but the Commerce Department's BIO, a specific bureau dedicated to overseeing export restrictions like this. They have a license regime for certain sensitive technologies, and part of the license is that if you do buy that technology, you cannot sell it on to a entity of any kind that is barred from purchasing it by the U.S. government. Now, of course, all of that is porous. There's ways to get around that. Oversight is imperfect. Washington is not omnipotent, right? So, there are efforts, often successful to evade those restrictions. But in general, it's not as simple as just buying from a company that already exists in a third-party country so that you can get around sanctions. Those companies are themselves subject to licensing restrictions and also can be penalized with sanctions. The United States has what's called the foreign product rule, in which a entity of any kind that is found to be selling sensitive technology or what have you that has any kind of input from the United States, it doesn't even have to be a product they bought from the United States. It can be a product that is partly made from U.S. materials or even software. And if that entity is found to be selling that technology onto somebody that the Washington does not want them to, then the foreign product rule can be used to sanction them and not deny them the product per se, but to prevent American producers from selling to that entity. So, if you're buying something that is made from American software, then any company building that good with that software will be targeted by the foreign product rule and affected by it if they do not also then agree not to sell to the entity that was selling on to the listed forbidden buyer. So it's not that Washington hasn't thought all of this out. There are efforts to try to mitigate re-export, but it's just even Washington with all of its capacity. It's the largest administration on the planet. Even with all of that administrative capacity, there's only so much Washington can do. Mm-hmm. So, yes, you can buy from third-party countries, but it's not as simple as it sounds. You do have to set up shell corporations and all this other kind of stuff. There's a lot of corruption involved in the process.
Yeah, they make it difficult to do so.
Yeah. It is not riskless. Let's put it like that.
Mm-hmm.
So talking about these export restrictions, I guess I just wanted to offer a small update on the impact. Unsurprisingly, given what I just said, the overall impact has been limited. One of the biggest short-term impacts had to do with human capital. Part of the export restrictions is that there was a general ban on Americans from working in the semiconductor industry in China. That's not exactly how they worded it, but basically the way they worded the rule is that if you're American, you cannot work in the tech sector in China, or at least in the vast majority of it. So a lot of Americans ended up leaving the market. And because a number of Americans had been key sources of skilled labor for a number of these industries, there was a short-term shock. Adjustments have been made. The United States is not the only country in the world that produces talented engineers of one kind or another. So, there has been efforts to replace them. But it has been costly and it has taken time to do so. So it's not as though it has not been entirely unimpactful. But for the most part, that was the main short-term impact. Longer term, limited. Part of the issue is that the United States is in particular concerned with the development of semiconductors that are relevant to the military and to military applications. But the issue there is that, while that could be an issue in the long term with regard to AI and drone swarms and whatnot, at the moment, most military chips and military applications of semiconductors do not require a lot of power. They actually can live perfectly well off of older generations of chips. what they call mature nodes in the industry. And so even though we've cut them off from the most advanced chips, you can still sell them, just regular chips. Certainly like older generation chips, that's still totally legal. And since those are the main ones that military is used, well, specifically the Chinese military are using, effectively the United States is still supplying the People's Liberation Army with all of their microchip needs, somewhat ironically. Maybe that'll change in the future, but for now, the United States has not been willing to go to that extent. That's not just because the money is considered, important or because of industry lobbying. It's also an enforcement thing. It's a lot harder to enforce export restrictions on the export of all chips than it is on a narrow segment of the market. Advanced chips have a narrower, more identifiable supply chain. And so just by focusing on them in particular, your export restrictions are going to be more impactful. But older chips, lots of countries produce older chips. It's not that unusual. The equipment is pretty much readily available. You would need very, very broad-ranging export restrictions in order to fully stop the export of just regular chips to China. And China itself, in particular, has been catching up in terms of semiconductor technology, specifically the production of semiconductors. There's still a couple generations from catching up with the West completely. When I say generations, I mean generations of technology, not generations of people. There's still a couple technological generations behind Western semiconductors. But in terms of producing like just basic bitch semiconductors, they can do that. That's not too difficult. They've already imported the equipment necessary. They have the human capital necessary. They can do that. So a lot of their military requirements are actually met with chips they produce themselves. That's not that big a deal for them. And there's not much the US can do about that. So export restrictions on that count have not been successful. More importantly, the restrictions targeted a lot of the software that is used in the production of semiconductors. Even if a lot of stuff is not manufactured in the United States anymore, a lot of the high-end design stuff relevant to production actually is still in the United States. And there's a lot of relevant software used in the manufacturing sector all over the world that still has its roots in the United States. And that includes software that is used to design microchips. And this software is called EDA. I don't remember what the acronym stands for. That seems to be the running theme for the night. But EDA is the relevant software that you use for designing microchips, and the United States has a very strong position in that market. And export restrictions were supposed to limit, if not completely cut off, China from that software. But in practice, there's been lots of workarounds. So in effect, Chinese producers and even Chinese students still have access to EDA software from the United States. In the article I was reading about this, they interviewed some students who were studying semiconductors and were trying to become engineers in that field. And what they said is that, if China ever were cut off from EDA software, it would be a major blow to the semiconductor industry in China. Because even though there are technically alternatives that China has been working on to American-made EDA software, it's not as good, and apparently it's not as easy as just changing software, right? The software is specialized for the production of particular architectures. And so, changing software would require changing a lot more than just the software. You'd have to change like whole swaths of the infrastructure and the capital equipment that you're using in the industry. So they said, that was my understanding. So if they did lose access to EDA software, that would put the semiconductor industry in China in a very difficult position. But as is, it's been relatively simple to work around those restrictions. And so access to the software continues largely unimpaired. So that's a quick update on the October 22 export restrictions. And to kind of cap things off vis-a-vis China here, I was going to talk about outbound investment restrictions. These are not final. What has been announced thus far by the Biden administration has been a preliminary outline of what these restrictions will probably look like. There's still going to be a commentary period, which is actually very different than what they did with the restrictions announced back in October. The October 22 restrictions were announced and then implemented in short order. There was virtually no public commentary period like there would normally be with a policy proposal of this significance, a policy change of that significance. But in the case of the outbound investment restrictions, they're taking a much slower pace. So they are going to allow public commentary. Public commentary probably sounds kind of boring, but it's actually very important because it allows all of the interested stakeholders that are going to be impacted by a given policy change an opportunity to go and comment on the change and perhaps give the government perspective and insight on the impacts that will be had, and give the government an opportunity to calibrate the policy in a way that will achieve the desired objective of the original policy while mitigating the harmful impacts that it would have otherwise had if it had not been changed. So public commentary is an important part of the policymaking process. It's just not a very sexy one. People in the news don't cover it a lot. So industry is very happy that they're taking a slower tack here that does involve public commentary. We'll see what impact it has on the final rules. There probably will be changes made. So what we're going to talk about here is these just early preliminary rules that have been announced thus far. So what they focused on, again, is outbound investment. So these rules, if implemented, will restrict the ability of American investors to take their money, go to China, and then invest that money in Chinese companies, Chinese research and development efforts, Chinese technology, et cetera. And the idea, of course, is that when investors from the United States use their money like that, they're effectively helping a rival country develop technology that could be used against the United States at a later date. And of course, again, the interest is mainly in terms of the military applications of those technologies, but in practice, a lot of the technology we're talking about here is what's called dual use technology, which is technology that has both civilian applications and military applications. And in so much as that's the case, it's very difficult for governments to kind of parse them and focus and compartmentalize them in one or the other, such that you can just focus on the military tech and restrict those and restrict investment in that, while continuing to allow investment in civilian tech that is otherwise harmless. In effect, technology is both civilian and military, and so you kind of have to make a judgment call about whether the risk of investing in military technology is sufficient to justify the cost of barring investment in civilian technology. You might not think of investment in another country's technology as a cost per se. Well, blocking your investment in another country's technology as a cost per se. But when you invest in another country's technology, you have a stake in it, right? You have an interest in it. Part of that technology is yours. And by threatening to cut off investment, you do have some leverage there. So by blocking off that investment, you are losing some leverage. You're creating some short-term penalties in terms of the development of the other country's technology, but in the long term, you actually are giving up some leverage there. So that's the penalty there, and that's the trade-off between military and civilian outbound investment restrictions. Anyway, the outbound investment restrictions that the Biden administration is talking about regard three specific technologies: semiconductors, artificial intelligence, and quantum computing. That's very specifically what they're focusing on, and they're even more narrowly focused on very particular applications of these technologies. I'll get a little ahead of myself here and say that one of the takeaways that industry took from this announcement was that the administration is going to take a very narrow approach as far as regulating outbound investment. There had been concerns that the administration would very broadly restrict American investment in China's economy across the board with regard to relevant technologies. But instead, it looks like instead like the outbound investment restrictions are very, very laser-like focused on very particular areas of concern. So a lot of American investment, if not most American investment in China, what remains of it anyway, is probably not going to be all that affected by these. So I'll kind of get into that a little more later, but for now, I'm going to talk about the details. So as far as semiconductors, outbound investment restrictions are going to regard, one, logic and memory chips. So specifically logic and memory chips that are related to the design, the fabrication, and or the packaging of advanced logic and memory chips. So you can see here they're focused still on advanced chips and not just general chips. Also, two, outbound investment restrictions will apply to semiconductors related to supercomputers with advanced chips. More specifically, the installation of supercomputers powered by advanced chips. I'm not sure about the significance of the word installation there. I haven't really seen that before, but nominally, the administration does not want American investors assisting Chinese with the development of supercomputers. And in so much as advanced semiconductors are part and parcel of that, they're going to restrict investment into those specific semiconductors. 3, outbound investment restrictions will apply to relevant capital equipment, so specifically software and machine tools required to manufacture chips. This is kind of an extension of the export restrictions. The export restrictions prevent anybody from exporting machine tools required to manufacture chips to China. Outbound investment will prevent anybody from the United States from investing in Chinese manufacturers of that equipment in China. So yin and yang there, basically. So that's semiconductors. As far as AI and quantum, the restrictions are actually even more limited. In terms of quantum, the restrictions apply to basically 3 categories here. 1, quantum computers, specifically a ban on the investment in the production of quantum computers and their components. Also, quantum sensing platforms, more specifically, any quantum sensing platforms that are related to any application involving military intelligence or surveillance.
What is a quantum sensing platform?
Basically, they're referring here to potential quantum technology that could be used for, say, radar. So, for example, detecting stealth aircraft or similar such, applications. Hypothetically, with quantum computation, you would be able to process more data that you get from sensors in the form of radar or other detection applications and detect things that otherwise you would not be able to detect just with the extra processing power. I would point out here that technically radar actually can detect stealth aircraft, but the radar signature of stealth aircraft is so small it's basically indistinguishable from a bird. And because there's obviously a lot of clutter, from birds and other, random shit in the air, radars are generally designed to filter out smaller signatures like that. So you can see stealth aircraft, you just have trouble distinguishing stealth aircraft from a goose. And that being the case, if you try to shoot down what you think is a stealth aircraft, you may end up accidentally blowing up just an innocent goose. Therein lies the problem. Yeah, so with greater computational power and a stronger radar, it could hypothetically be possible to distinguish the radar signature of even a small stealth aircraft from something else, like, say, a goose or whatever. So quantum sensing platforms would be something like that. That's kind of what they have in mind here. Also, export restrictions will apply here to quantum communication systems, specifically those that are designed to be exclusively used for secure communications. The idea here basically has to do with 1, encryption, and then also hacking encryption. They don't specifically mention, decryption, but that's kind of part and parcel. Quantum encryption has the potential to be very powerful, such that you could basically create communications that are impossible to decrypt. And obviously, that would have a very important and useful military application in the event of a conflict. So the United States government does not want investors involved in that. Okay, so that's quantum. In terms of artificial intelligence, they basically just don't want American investors to invest in anything involving the development of software that incorporates AI that could be used for military, government intelligence, or mass surveillance end uses, quote unquote. So basically here they're narrowly focused on artificial intelligence's military applications. Again, they're probably going to take a pretty broad definition of military application since, again, dual-use technology kind of blurs the line between military and civilian. But in general here, they're taking a relatively narrow focus here. They could easily write the rule to just say all of it. You can't invest in artificial intelligence companies in China, but instead they are trying to kind of parse that to focus on military applications. So that's the details here. Again, the takeaway has been that people have been surprised by how narrow the application has been in practice. The export restrictions were expected to apply more broadly, to broader areas of the relevant technologies of concern. But instead, the government has tried to focus, kind of narrow them down a bit. If you're wondering why they did that, there was a debate within the Biden administration that was probably a very long-running debate, going back to 2021, between the national security side of the administration, specifically as led by the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan. I hope I'm getting his name right. There's another guy who has a very similar name that I'm always mixing him up with. So the National Security Council kind of took a more hawkish view and wanted broader restrictions on exports and investment. But then the other faction within the administration was led by the Treasury Department and the Commerce Department. And both of those departments were of the mind that it would be more effective and less intrusive to the US economy in particular to just focus restrictions more narrowly, to look at specific technologies that were of concern and not just the broader technology sector. So clearly, the results of these preliminary rules suggest that Treasury and Commerce won that debate. The implications that have over the long term are not entirely clear, but for now, it looks like the Treasury Department and the Commerce Department have the inside track on America's China policy right now, and in other words, a relatively dovish approach to the problem. The Trump administration actually had a very similar dynamic play out. By and large, it was the more dovish faction that won out up until 2020. In 2020, they got more hawkish, but that didn't last very long. So let's see. Anyway, I was talking about takeaway. So takeaway restrictions are narrower than expected. Also, as part and parcel of that expectation, it was also expected that the investment restrictions might also include China's biotech sector, as well as its green technology sector. As is, those were both excluded. So that's what we're dealing with. Those are the preliminary rules that have been outlined. I also drew up a critique here, based off of some of the stuff I've read. Some of the issues that have been brought up in critiquing the rules thus far, for one, a lot of relevant investments in areas of technology have been excluded. U.S. has invested in a pretty wide number of technologies in China, and these restrictions do not really touch on any of that. So that kind of goes back to the tall fence, small yard approach to the whole economic issue between China and the United States. It's all good and well if you want to go after the narrow range of technologies, but there's a lot of other technologies that are of concern, and it doesn't seem as of yet that the Biden administration has any particular plan for those yet. Another big criticism I saw: notification can be made after an investment has been made. So with investment restrictions, you would think that companies would just be broadly barred from investing in these areas, and that if they were thinking of investing in an area that is related to them, that they would be required to notify the government of that fact beforehand. That's actually not the case. The way it's going to work from a regulatory perspective, at least as the rules are written right now, is that firms can just kind of invest however they want in China, and then they will only be required to notify the US government of the nature of their investments after the fact. So that's obviously a flaw, because if you don't want anybody to invest in specific technology sectors, preventing them from doing that or requiring them to rescind those investments after the fact is going to blunt the impact of the restriction. You want the money not to be there in the first place, not to take it away after the fact. By the time you figure it out and require the company to pull out of the market, the damage has kind of already been done. So that might be something they change in the future, or it could just be a sign that the government is really going particularly softly in terms of the way that they want to go about approaching the issue. One or the other. Also, another criticism, and this isn't too bad, especially compared to the notification thing, but the way the rule is written, they're actually going to grandfather in pre-existing investments. So if you're an American company or investor and you're already invested in one of these sensitive technology areas, if these rules pass, you will not be required to pull out of that investment. You can actually continue doing it, continue to hold that position in China's market. So, that's not too bad. Again, the damage has kind of already been done at that point. But it does kind of suggest that the government is more focused on minimizing disruption to the existing economy and to existing trade, rather than purely focused on national security considerations. No surprise, given that it was probably Commerce and Treasury departments that kind of won the debate. Those are obviously not national security institutions. Okay, so what about impact here? Well, some of the criticism I've read has suggested that the impact on quantum computing technology in China will probably be minimal, maybe even nothing. For one, from what I read anyway, there is apparently no US investment right now in Chinese quantum startups. Also, most of the development in quantum technology in China is happening in government-run labs, which are not really subject to investment in the first place. Also, there are some producers of inputs that are used to make quantum computers and whatnot in the United States that could be affected by the rule, but apparently those companies do not sell to China. Not necessarily because they don't want to, but they just don't have that market share. European producers actually do have the market share, so there could be an opportunity there for restrictions. But the United States does not, nominally anyway, have jurisdiction over Europe. So as far as American investment restrictions go, it seems like the impact on quantum will be just very limited. Also, an interesting point that was also made here, apparently there are very few existing applications for quantum technology at this stage. The technology is still very, very early development. And so what that means is that there's not actually a lot of substantive stuff right now to invest in. It's very much still in its early stage where researchers are trying to just get it to work at all. It's not yet at a stage where there are commercial operators trying to commercialize it and scale up the technology. The technology just isn't even really there. So as of yet, quantum is not really a thing. So banning restrictions into something that doesn't really exist yet, obviously, is not going to be very impactful. So that's one of the primary criticisms there of the quantum side of the investment restrictions. Now, as far as AI, the situation is a little more unclear. There probably are substantive U.S. investment positions in China as far as AI companies, but we don't really have data for that, apparently. So it's not really clear just how much disruption there could be there. I did have this from the article I read. U.S. investors participated in 1/3 of investment deals involving Chinese AI companies from 2015 to 2021. And also it was noted that the percentage of those investments that come from the U.S. investors is unknown. So there's involvement, but the exact extent of that involvement is not really clear. That came from the Center for Security and Emerging Technology, for what it's worth. So the relevance, the author here argues, is not so much in the impact in the short term, probably pretty limited, depending on how extensive U.S. investment is. They think that the significance of the outbound investment restrictions here is more lay in how they lay the groundwork for future restrictions. More specifically, the export restrictions that were announced back in 2022 in October focused very narrowly on semiconductors. They did not extend to AI. But with these outbound investment restrictions touching on AI, there's a much stronger expectation now that there will be future export restrictions to complement them. And in order to further kind of cement restrictions regarding China's AI industry generally. Also, they suspect that this could be the lead-in for future restrictions on cloud computing. I didn't know this, but apparently you can you can do cloud stuff with supercomputers. And so one of the ways that China has been getting around restrictions on the development of their supercomputers is just using supercomputers that are provided via cloud located in other countries. So in order to kind of mitigate that, there has been talk in the United States about restricting access to cloud resources outside of China, certainly in the United States. That's relevant to artificial intelligence because a lot of the technology that is used to train AI models involves significant computing power.
So it seems like a lot of these changes overall involve specifically targeting the highest technology and protecting that when it comes to trade, and that's related mainly to military applications, but also it's meant to bring just longer term economic pressure and keep that technology edge away from a rival.
Yeah, the only real coherent strategy that I've heard from Washington vis-a-vis competition with China regards staying a couple generations ahead of China technologically. So, it's recognized that it would be extremely difficult to stop China from developing technologically completely, so that's not considered realistic. Neither is it considered realistic to continue to allow unencumbered trade with China, because the party has made it clear that, well, it hasn't really made anything clear. It's clear that the party's intentions are unclear. Let's put it like that. And that being the case, continuing to allow investment in technological improvements that could be used against the United States and its foreign and its interests abroad at a later date is not really an acceptable state of affairs. So some kind of middle ground was needed. There's no real consensus on what that middle ground will be. But one thing that has been agreed thus far is that the United States should, if nothing else, take what steps are necessary to ensure it stays at least a couple generations ahead of China technologically. So in so much as that is the thus far only real pillar of American policy vis-a-vis competition with China, all of these restrictions make sense. All of these export restrictions and outbound investment restrictions very much are in keeping with that foreign policy objective. But yeah, there's definitely been criticism that there should be other technologies that are less advanced that should also be included in these restrictions.
Were there any examples?
That's a good argument. Sorry, what?
Were there any examples of those? Less advanced, but still worth limiting?
The military applications.
Gotcha.
Because again, the chips used for military applications are way less advanced than the most cutting edge stuff. But right now, the US has not really restricted those as of yet. There are a lot of military institutions that have been placed on entities lists. Well, the entities list, meaning that you're not supposed to sell to them. But realistically, you can get around those. Like if you're the Chinese military, you can set up a shell company and then get it that way. And that's been happening a lot. You need much broader export restrictions and outbound investment restrictions to realistically stop that. And more importantly, you would need a lot of diplomatic effort expended to get allied countries to participate in those kinds of export regimes as well. And I suspect the diplomatic side is the bigger issue for the Biden administration. If not for that, they probably would restrict exports of that kind into China. But as is, it would be just way too easy to get around those restrictions, and the restrictions themselves would have onerous commercial repercussions for American companies and their market share. So right now, the Biden administration is probably of the opinion that while it would be desirable to limit the export of a broader range of chips to China, it's only going to be feasible if it is done simultaneously in conjunction with a broad range of American allies, especially those that themselves are an important part of the semiconductor supply chain. And right now, that's a very heavy lift. Big tech companies, semiconductor producers, are important to the political economy of places like Japan, less so in the Netherlands, but in general, they generate enough revenue that those governments are very reluctant to significantly take steps that would curb it. And Japan and Europe in particular have economies that are kind of sluggish right now, overall, in general. And that being the case, they're very loath to put restrictions on one of the few growth industries that they have with which to kind of generate revenue for governments that are otherwise hard-pressed by debt issues and political obligations, entitlements, and whatnot. So diplomatically and politically, it's a heavy lift to expect partner nations to implement broad-based restrictions like that. The United States can do it with relatively little cost. Other countries cannot do it at very little cost. It's going to have a much bigger cost relative to the size of their economies. And so it's going to take either a lot of negotiations to get them on board, or it's going to take the United States giving up on it and giving that as a concession in exchange for getting them on board with a narrower range of restrictions so that we can at least have some impact on China's technological development. So that's where we are. That's your China update for the day.
Nice. Appreciate that. There was a question somewhat related to this region. Chat's asking if the Fukushima wastewater discharge was discussed at all. It was a huge freak out by Korea/China. Is this a big deal? Why or why not?
Not really. I mean, environmentally, it's an issue. I mean, even environmental groups in Japan are kind of concerned by it. But from what I've read, scientifically speaking, it should not be that big a deal. Like, the impact should be pretty limited.
What is it that happened for those who didn't know?
Well, I'm sure you recall the nuclear reactor issue back in Fukushima 10 years ago.
Uh-huh.
So the wastewater in the reactor well, the water that was in the reactor when the reactor had its issue. I don't think it melted down, but it had an issue, so basically stopped working. And the water that was in the reactor at that time is actually still there. You know, they also had to pump in a bunch of water in an effort to try to cool it off. So that excess water was also there. I think it's like some large number of Olympic pools worth of water is basically still in the reactor, and it's radioactive. And the government just hasn't really been able to figure out like a good way to dispose of it that is going to make everybody happy. And it's been delaying the issue for like 10 years now. And so the government basically said, okay, well, the environmental damage and the threat posed to human life from just releasing it into the ocean, especially if we just do it incrementally over the course of 10 years, is minimal. It's not dangerous. And so the Japanese government decided to just deal with it that way. We're going to dump it in the ocean a little bit at a time over 10 years, and then we'll deal with it. And then the water will be gone, and we can actually do something with the reactor again. So that's a practical solution. That's probably the best way to go about it in the grand scheme of things. But everybody who has a bone to pick with Japan has been using it as an excuse to shit on them. So yeah, there is some reason for concern, but it's been blown way out of proportion by various malefactors. And there is actually an established Chinese information campaign to blow it out of proportion and try to make Japan look bad. Some of that actually doesn't have anything to do with the water itself. Like the Chinese effort to go after Japan here actually has more to do with a recent meeting. I think it was the G20. Actually, let me look that up. I don't think I put it in I have different sets of notes here, and keeping them organized can be yeoman's work. But basically, there was an international meeting, and the Japanese government agreed to sign on to a final statement at the end of the meeting in which they kind of criticized China, like mildly. And China hates that. So whenever stuff like that happens, they always retaliate to some degree. And so in this case, the retaliation is in the form of an information campaign trying to make the case that Japan is poisoning the Pacific and treating the Pacific Ocean like its own personal sewer.
Which is technically true, but I think the immediate danger level is the thing that's being contested. Because it is waste and they are putting it in global waters, which I can understand why that would be off-putting to a lot of people. Yeah. The question is, like, what is the ideal way of dealing with that? I think the way that they're dealing with that is a solution that gets it out of their yard or pool, whatever you want to call it. But yeah, can kind of feel ugly. And then also, in this case, it's used as leverage.
Yeah. Oh, I found it here. It wasn't a meeting. It was a joint statement that was made with the United States government and the government of South Korea. And in the statement, they called out China's "quote unquote" dangerous and aggressive behavior, end quote, in the region. So, pretty mild overall, but, Beijing always feels like it has to do something. Or more specifically, Chinese diplomats feel like they have to do something.
Wolf warrior diplomacy.
Yeah. Yeah, they kind of cut back on that over the past couple of years, but they do still take kind of a harder line than they used to on superficial bullshit like this. Mm-hmm. But it's not substantive. Like the Chinese are not making some kind of demand here in exchange for stopping the criticism. It's basically criticism for the sake of criticism and retaliation for the joint statement. But eventually, it's just going to go away, and people will barely remember it. So this is just theater. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't read too much into it.
But is it good theater?
Yeah, kind of. I mean, it's gotten popular in South Korea. Lots of people there have been shitting on Japan. Mm-hmm. But they never really need a reason to shit on Japan in South Korea.
Yeah, they're already pretty skilled at that.
Yeah. Yeah, lots of historical baggage there that they can use. Gosh, what else did we have here? Well, I guess I should add, were there any other questions?
Not that I saw.
Okay. And we got China. How much time did we have left?
We've got 30 minutes.
30 minutes, okay. That's probably not enough time for China's economy. I was going to update on that, but we'll probably save that for next time. In general, China's economy has been experiencing issues. There have been a number of structural problems that have been popping up and kind of reaching their inevitable conclusion. But it's not as bad as some of the media would have you believe. You know, it's not, China's economy is not going to crash or anything, but it is going to slow down for sure. Yeah, I think the real question is, how do they deal with these structural problems? That is not entirely clear. It seems to me, given what I've seen about, given what I've read about policy responses in Beijing to the current economic issues in the country, that there's a very real and ongoing battle between liberals and old hardline communists within the party. You know, if it were just the communists in charge, they would be taking a much more statist approach to these problems. But as is, you can kind of see that they have some liberal ideas in mind for how to try to solve it. When I say liberal ideas, what I mean is that they're going to try to let the free market resolve itself here, and to try to avoid moral hazard problems that would come from more direct state intervention. Yeah, what the government is doing is not fully liberal either. You know, if they were doing a liberal reform here, they would be doing a lot more, and that's not happening. But what they have been doing seems like a mix between statist approaches and liberal approaches, and that suggests to me that there's a lot of compromises being made between different factions within the party. Mm-hmm. Given how much the government was leaning towards state-owned enterprises a couple years ago, and how much Xi Jinping and his approach very much focused on the state in China's economy, it seems like the weight is shifting a little more back towards the liberals. That's sheer conjecture on my part. I can't really prove that. I don't think anybody can, but I'm kind of inferring here, just based off of the weight of policy announcements coming out of Beijing, that it seems like the liberals are getting more traction. We'll see how long that lasts. That could just be a temporary thing that they're doing in response to current issues, but it is somewhat encouraging, at least, in so much as it suggests that the economy could be opened up and managed better if the liberals are allowed to kind of have their way with it. Yeah, statists in China do not have a good record with China's economy. That has deep roots. U.S. economy has also been interesting. The U.S. economy, I won't get into too much depth here either. I've got a lot of notes I need to organize on it. But basically, the U.S. economy is still weirdly strong. I sometimes hear people, generally politicians or political pundits of one kind or another, describe the U.S. economy as fragile, and that is not the case. It's really not fragile. You know, the Federal Reserve is actively trying to choke out the economy. It's got both of its hands around its throat and has for months, actually years now. And it just doesn't seem to be having an effect.
Why are they trying to choke out the economy?
That's how they're trying to deal with inflation.
Oh.
They want inflation to go down, and so they've been raising interest rates in order to try to slow down economic growth.
But we just keep growing?
We just keep growing. It just keeps happening. And economists can't really explain it. There's supposed to be a pretty strong correlation between unemployment and interest rates and growth, right? All of those are supposed to move pretty much in conjunction, and inflation, right? The relationship is supposed to be that, as inflation gets higher, that's supposed to reflect strong output, strong economic growth, and in turn, low unemployment. And so then, as the economy cools off, slows down, and maybe enters recession, inflation falls, but then output falls as well, and then also unemployment goes up. So that's, in general, what economists expect to see in data. And instead, we see just data all over the place now. Like, it just doesn't make sense, according to traditional theory that economists have largely relied on. Well, I shouldn't say just theory. There's also a lot of empirical data that had backed that up, for much of the 20th century. But in the 21st century, it seems like we need some new interpretations here to try to understand the relationship between inflation, unemployment, and output. Because right now, it's acting real squirrely. Inflation has moderated. It is still going down. Core inflation in particular, the PCE, which is the measure that the Federal Reserve likes to use, that's been moderating over time. It's been moderating very slowly, like 0.1 percentage point or two every quarter. I'm sure the Federal Reserve would like it to fall faster, but I guess they're happy at this point that it's falling at all. And, they're certainly not borderline panicking like they were, back when inflation was like 6% annualized or 8% annualized, whatever it was that it peaked at a while back. So that seems to be trending in the right direction, even if it's still kind of relatively high. Their target inflation rate is 2%, and right now it's at like 3.8, thereabouts. Mm-hmm. So it's well, actually lower than 3.8. 3 point something. It's still higher than it needs to be, basically. And the Federal Reserve has been jerking up interest rates. I think it's, what is it, like 5-6% now? And it had been like 0.25% when they started. So those are significant increases. I know it doesn't sound like much, but that's like a 500, 6 whatever percent increase in interest rates. And just the impact hasn't been there. And the Federal Reserve and economists don't know what to do about that. So inflation is down, output is up, but it's slowing. Like the rate of increase is slowing over time. And so it seems to be kind of trending towards stabilizing, or perhaps towards an eventual downturn. That's not, people earlier this year were talking about a recession. They were thinking that inflation would, collapse, and then that would reflect a general downturn in economic activity that would lead into a recession. But instead, it's looking like we might actually get a mild recession or even a no recession. We may actually just get mild stagnation. It's just very mild growth, very little economic growth, but otherwise no general downturn. And given that should hypothetically reduce inflation, that would actually represent the absolute ideal outcome that the Federal Reserve had in mind when they actually started taking inflation seriously and started hiking interest rates a while back. So a soft landing, the ideal outcome, might actually be the real outcome for once. It's been a while since we've seen the government or a government agency of any kind have an objective and actually achieve it. But we might actually be pretty close here.
Wow.
As remarkable as that may be, it might actually happen this time.
In breaking news, something actually went well for once. Experts were very confused.
Yeah, that's pretty much where we are right now as far as the U.S. economy. So there's other data too. There is some negative data. For example, in general, consumption has been very robust, but the labor market is slackening a little bit, right? Ideally, I'm speaking as an economist here, if you are trying to slow down the economy to decrease inflation, what you want to see is higher unemployment. But we have not seen that. Unemployment remains very, very low, almost at historically low levels, which itself is bizarre. And we've also seen correspondingly a very high quit rate. So the quit rate is the rate at which people quit their jobs, generally to find a better job. So if there's a high quit rate and a low unemployment rate, that's a very good sign that you have a tight labor market, lots of employment, lots of job openings, et cetera. That's still the case, even in spite of all the interest rate hikes and the relatively moderate output growth. In fact, somewhat weirdly, labor has, jobs and employment have actually grown faster than output at times. That itself is also weird. I can actually explain that, but we can get to that later. The point here, though, is that recently the quit rate has started to moderate a bit. So, right, fewer people are quitting their jobs to go find other jobs. And so while the unemployment rate is still near historically low levels, and wages have not really started to fall, they're actually still growing, and they're actually growing in real terms now because inflation has moderated. But the fact that the quit rate has started to fall suggests that the labor market is slackening a little bit. That's also reflected a little bit in the new jobs data. There's, I think, fewer job openings now than there have been. The ratio of job openings to workers hasn't really changed much, but in general, there are fewer jobs and fewer people are quitting. So that suggests that there's at least the beginning of a potential trend towards higher unemployment and correspondingly lower output and lower inflation. So the Federal Reserve would consider that good news. Probably not great if you're a worker, but I would point out too that this is very early data here. Well, not early data, but very early in a potential trend. It may not even be a trend. It could be that this is reverses next quarter, or that unemployment just stays low, for the foreseeable future somehow. But that is a negative trend there in a sense, albeit just the beginning of one. Also, household balance sheets are just very unhealthy right now. There's a lot of debt. Household debt is very high, and people have very much been borrowing money to try to stay afloat here. It's a little hard to interpret household debt because, a lot of debt is actually just well-off people buying expensive houses. Mortgages are like the biggest part of household debt. I think I read that 70% of household debt is just mortgages. And obviously, that's going to be relatively skewed towards more expensive mortgages by people with higher incomes. I tried to find some data on that, but I wasn't able to find too much. I kind of inferred based off of what I found that maybe 20% or so of the total value of mortgages is like really expensive houses. But that was very rough data, and I would not rely on that. Don't quote me on that, in other words. But anyway, the point here is that people have borrowed a lot of money, partly to deal with all of the higher prices and whatnot, and certainly higher housing prices, higher housing costs, I should say. Rent is also an issue. But the issue here is that people have started to spend a little bit less, and also people are starting to default on their loans at a higher rate. So there is a mildly higher default rate for loans, including things like auto loans and whatnot, that has been noted in the data. So that could suggest that households have reached their limit, that they can no longer sustain current levels of consumption and borrowing, that there's going to be a deleveraging pending that will invariably cut into their spending and correspondingly will result and translate into lower overall consumption. And given that overall consumption is the primary driver of the US economy, that it could have significant effects on the overall economy going forward. All of that assumes, of course, that eventually people actually do spend less money. That's not entirely clear. It would make sense, given the amount of leveraging that's happened. You would expect deleveraging at some point, but nothing else makes sense anymore. So I don't know, maybe people just spend at current levels indefinitely somehow, and then consumption doesn't fall. I don't know. Nobody knows what the fuck is going on. Like that's the main conclusion that economists have come to with regard to the US economy right now. Everybody is very much learning how the economy works right now. But when you're still learning how something works, you're really not in a position to forecast what's going to happen later. Mm-hmm. And so forecasts are pretty rare and very unreliable right now as a result. So given what we know, it seems like the US economy is slowing, but the rate of slowing is very itself slow. And so it may be that we're headed towards just mild growth or a mild downturn, one or the other. Nothing really particularly exciting, which is kind of what you want, in so much as it leads to lower inflation without a huge spike in unemployment or something equally dramatic. Just a mild downturn in the economy and relatively low growth to kill inflation. That's the ideal strategy. That seems to be working, and consumption does not seem to be suffering too much for it for now. So that's kind of where we are.
Nice. U.S. economy pretty strong, relatively stable. I feel like there were people who were saying that it was going to bust hard a few years back, and I don't know if it actually did happen. It's been chugging along.
No, it never did. Like, people were during the pandemic were saying that there might be an L-shaped recovery, where the pandemic hits, guts the economy, and then the economy is just in depression for the foreseeable future. Mm-hmm. Instead, the economy recovered at the end of 2020 and then boomed in 2021, and then it continued to perform very strongly into 2022 with disturbingly high inflation correspondingly. And that was the point at which the Federal Reserve finally jumped in and was like, okay, we have to do something. And so that leads into 2023, where we are now. So everything seems to be going according to plan, which was not the expected outcome. I think I talked before on here about all the different expectations that the market had had for the economy since 2020, and about how they've been wrong 100% of the time every year since 2020. So the expectation this year is that there would be probably a recession, but that inflation would go down. And instead, we've seen possibly no recession, but with inflation going down. So that's been the surprise this year. To be fair, and this is worth pointing out, a big part of low inflation in the United States, or at least the moderation in inflation, probably has a lot to do with China too. China's economy has been underperforming. We'll talk about that next time, some of the details, but China's economy has been underperforming, has not grown nearly as much as people had been expecting. And correspondingly, commodity prices and whatnot have been relatively low, much more so than had been expected. And so the United States has probably been a big beneficiary of that. If the Chinese economy had boomed, probably oil prices would have gone up, gasoline prices would have gone up, a lot of household items would have gone up, along with all the inputs and commodities that are used to produce them. So it would have been a problem. Inflation probably would have been a bigger story in the United States if China's economy had performed to expectations. But instead, for a number of reasons that we'll get into later, it did not. And so that's been much to the benefit of the Federal Reserve.
I didn't really think about that as a factor of the main economic rival is not doing well, and that means that we get a benefit as a result of their struggling.
Yeah, that's kind of been an untold story. I think people are aware that China has been a major driver of economic growth over time, but I wonder sometimes if people in the United States really fully understand just how much their own inflation, and especially gasoline prices, have been impacted by China. I remember way back in the day when I was in college, back in the heady days of 2006, 2008, gasoline prices were like $4 to $5 a gallon. It was very expensive. And, people complained, but China did not really seem to come up in the conversation very often back then. People seemed a lot more focused on U.S. production in the Middle East, and especially, the Iraq War and whatnot. Obviously that was in the news a lot at the time. But China's role in that was very undersold, I feel. And really, it was probably mainly Chinese demand for oil as their economy boomed in the aughts that really drove up oil prices as much as they got. That was probably the main factor. But nobody was paying attention to China back then. It was not really a big story in the news. The big thing was terrorism in the Middle East and the housing market. That's what people were focused on. But ever since then, China's definitely played a role. China, whenever China's economy does well, gasoline prices have been higher in the United States and people complain. Whenever China's economy does poorly, gasoline prices fall, people are happy. That's a pretty consistent pattern in the United States. There's a couple exceptions. Obviously, there was a big price war between the Saudis and the Iranians starting around 2014. So that played a role as well. Certainly OPEC and its politics are a major determinant there. But Chinese demand is kind of an undersung factor there. So it's worth keeping track of them if you are concerned about pain at the pump, as they used to say.
Yep.
Every news story for years in the aughts was pain at the pump. They used that phrase more times than I can remember. It's burned into my memory.
I had a pain at the pump story pretty recently. I was hanging out with a fellow streamer and real life friend Apoptosis and his partner, and we were in line at a gas pump at a Costco, which you need a membership to be able to get gas there. And there was a person who pulled up in front of us who we could kind of overhear them shouting with the Costco people. They didn't actually own the vehicle, and they also didn't know how to pump gas, and they also didn't know that you had to be a Costco member to use said gas. It was just a lot of explaining and a very confusing situation. So we had some pain at the pump, but that was just based on that one would-be customer.
Well, that's about all I had on China for tonight. Do we still have any time left?
Yeah, got about 15 minutes.
15 minutes or so. I did have some weird news stuff kind of piled up here. Maybe we could get through some of that.
Yeah.
So you've heard of the G20 summit?
I would guess it's like the G10, but 10 more countries.
Well, kind of. I mean, basically, it's the G8 plus a bunch of powerful developing countries. So it's kind of an excuse. Well, well, not an excuse. It's a forum for the developed world to meet with the leaders of the developing world and discuss issues that they have in common.
Mm-hmm.
That was the idea behind the G20. The degree to which it's worked in practice is debatable, but that's the idea. So the next G20 summit is going to be held in New Delhi in India. And one of the problems they have in New Delhi is monkeys. Lots of monkeys running around. Sometimes they harass people, they steal food, whatever. You know, they're pests, basically.
Mm.
So in order to try to ensure the monkeys do not ruin the G20 summit, the Indian government is making an effort here to try to scare them away. And they've got two ways that they're doing it. One, they are creating life-size cutouts of gray langur monkeys and erecting them around the site of the G20 summit. Apparently, gray langur monkeys are the assholes of the monkey world, and the other monkeys are afraid of them. So there's an effort to kind of scare them with the cardboard cutouts there. And then they're also paying people, real live human beings, to emulate the langur monkey cry. They're apparently professionals at mimicking the langur monkey's sounds, and the government is paying them to basically walk around the G20 site and scare away other monkeys.
Do you have to get certified to be actually a person who can do this voice well, and you have someone who makes sure that you're not going to like do the wrong type of monkey and then say they get aroused or they get more excited? Because if you make the wrong monkey call, who knows what could happen next?
I don't think so. I think they've got a cohort of people that they use on the regular, because this isn't the first time they've done this.
Mm-hmm.
So they're just whipping out the langur monkey mimicry crew for the G20 summit.
I'm getting flashbacks to when they sent the plane full of ducks at the locust swarm.
Let's see. Have you ever heard of a sun bear?
Yes.
Yeah, it's kind of a very small animal. It's technically a bear, but it's not very intimidating. They're very, very short, kind of squat bears. So there was a zoo in eastern China that got into a social media kerfuffle with people, because there was a guy who took a picture of a sun bear and posted it online and said that it looked suspiciously like a guy in a suit. And people full stop believed him. Like, it really does look like a guy in a suit. It was standing on its hind legs, and the skin around its waist is really loose. So it looked like a bear suit. Like, it genuinely looked like a bear suit. And this guy said, this zoo is faking it. They just got a guy in a bear suit here pretending to be a bear. And so a whole bunch of people on China's internet started harassing this zoo, telling them that they had fake bears in their zoo. And the zoo had to come out and say that, no, it's not a fake bear. It's just a sun bear. They always look like that.
I just found an article here, or an image, and the tagline is, "Man in bear costume at Chinese zoo divides further opinion after waving to visitors." Is this a sun bear, or is this a man in a suit? Opinions in the chat. It's like that thing where it was a picture of some dress, and people are asking whether it's this one color or this other color, but it's kind of a not very well lit image. Which one is the real sun bear, chat? Do you think they could free the sun bear around this summit meeting to scare away the monkeys?
I don't know. I think it might be too small and slow.
You don't think the bear could deal with those monkeys? What kind of monkey is this again that was the pest?
All of them.
All of them?
There's multiple breeds of monkey in India. The gray langur monkey is just the one that they're using to scare the others off, because it's the more aggressive one.
Oh, man. I found a great image of this guy. Wow. Chat, this is an HD image of the gray langur monkey. And you can see why this was the one chosen to scare off those other monkeys. So people have been practicing to try to do the call of this monkey to scare them off. Yeah. He looks pissed. I'll fuck you up, bro. You're gonna mess up their meeting? I'll mess you up.
Yeah, animals can be a problem in India, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's a place of
Oh,
very high biodiversity and lots of rainfall and stuff, so lots of
yeah.
habitats.
Did you hear about the guy who went to North Korea?
No.
No. Oh, you're gonna like this one, Neuro. So there was an American soldier, and he had been held in detainment for some months over some transgression. And he was set, mind you, this is happening in South Korea. He was an American soldier in South Korea. He was set to be sent back to the United States for disciplinary hearings regarding what he did. I don't think it was ever made clear exactly what got him into trouble, but he had been in jail for some time. Supposedly, it involved some South Korean civilians. So before he was set to be flown back to the United States, he escaped his cell, and then he went to Panmunjom. I don't know if you've heard of that, but at the DMZ, there's a building that was constructed specifically to serve as a meeting point between the governments of North Korea and South Korea. And whenever you see pictures of like North Korean soldiers standing guard right across from South Korean soldiers, that's Panmunjom, right? That's like the point of contact between the two sides. And so this guy actually secretly joined, he snuck into a tourist group that was touring Panmunjom. And when they got close to the border with North Korea, he reportedly laughed, giggled even, and then just jumped right across, just ran into South Korea like a maniac. And he has not been seen since.
He ran into South Korea or North Korea?
He ran into North Korea.
Oh, geez.
He ran right into it, supposedly to get out of the disciplinary hearings that were set to be held in the United States. Now, for a couple of weeks, the North Korean government was pretty cagey about what had happened. Like didn't really admit it, they didn't comment on it. Eventually, they admitted that they had him in custody, but they didn't say like what they were doing or why he had done what he did. I think a week or two ago, the North Korean government came out and said that this guy said that he had come to North Korea in order to escape racism that he had experienced in the U.S. military. So he says. But the North Korean government, for its part, has not made any indication as of yet that they actually want to keep this guy. The U.S. government, for its part, has not really expended a lot of effort to get him back either. Their attitude is basically, you can kind of have him.
Yeah, so chat's saying that he was detained for assaulting the locals and destroying property. So, not really a class actor, setting a good example. Could see why we wouldn't
No.
be super possessive of someone like that.
Yeah. It's not like he was kidnapped or something. He kind of went there on his own will. So the State Department has not really made him a priority.
Makes sense.
So we'll see what happens to him. That's a pretty bold move running into North Korea. We'll see how that works out for him.
It sounds like an out of the frying pan and into the fire thing. I would guess that he would get chewed out and maybe dishonorably discharged or something, but to go into one of the most hostile and closed off countries in the world seems like maybe the dumbest move on the table. It's an interesting move for sure. Like, things that are very unique to an American citizen will happen to you if you do this. And maybe you think of yourself as being used for leverage, but based on his behavior being bad, like if he was a war hero or someone that we like really cared about, like because they did a bunch of stuff for our country, then yeah, maybe. But being someone who is being an asshat and then doing that is like, wow, interesting.
Yeah, I'm curious to see how it all plays out in the end. It's not even clear the North Korean government wants to keep him necessarily. They probably want to try to trade him for something, but I don't think the U.S. government is going to be that willing to trade much. So he may just be stuck there. Yeah, there was an American guy who defected way back in like the Korean War. I think there were a couple people like that, but there was one in particular that the North Korean government ended up using for propaganda purposes. And he actually just went on to play all of the American villains in their movies for the next like 40 years.
Mm.
But other than that guy, there really have not been many cases of defection to North Korea.
Mm-hmm.
As far as defections go, North Korea has not traditionally been considered one of the most ideal choices. So they haven't gotten a whole lot.
Yeah, not unless you're into getting disappeared, never being heard from
Exactly.
again.
I'm sure we've got some people who work in IT listening. I'm sure they'll appreciate this story. So you've heard of .mil, right? That's the domain name.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so military websites don't end in .com, they end in .mil.
Mm.
So what's apparently been happening for several years now is that people have been sending emails and whatnot to accounts and websites and whatnot that have that domain name, but because of a typo, they type .ml instead of .mil. And the thing about ML is that that's the suffix for the domain name of the West African country of Mali. So the result is that over a period of years, millions of US military emails have been mistakenly sent to Mali.
Oh, man.
And that's apparently been an ongoing issue because they first recognized the problem and started trying to address it in 2013. They've apparently got a whole mechanism set up to try to catch those emails and return them to their intended destination.
So when there's like a super advanced military regime that pops out of Mali, like we did that on accident. Whoops.
I don't know about that. Now, it's worth pointing out that none of the emails sent were classified. You know, when it comes to classified material, there's an intranet that the Pentagon uses. But it's still kind of stupid all the same. It's the kind of just amateurish mistake that you would not necessarily expect from the Pentagon. So given the kind of shenanigans that happens with IT at corporations, I thought some of you IT guys might appreciate that story.
Yeah, that's a slight misclick that has a pretty big impact. So that must mean that the people in Mali made emails to catch those? Because I would think it would just send it back and say that's not valid.
In a lot of cases, yeah, but every so often, it ends up on a server or something. It's at the very least end up routed into Mali where it could be intercepted,
Mm-hmm.
which is probably the bigger issue for the military. And they have set up mechanisms to try to bounce emails like that when they're sent.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not as though the emails were being sent directly to like email accounts and Mali's intelligence agency or something.
Mm-hmm.
But they should not have been really leaving the United States in the first place. That should have been largely kept on the U.S. internet. So therein lies the rub.
Well, awesome. I like the funny, weird stuff at the end. I'm now interested to learn about this gray langur monkey. It looks very grouchy. I'm going to send you the lovely image link of the one that I found that I think would be a good poster for recruitment if they need to find gray langur impersonators or impressionists. It's just a great photograph there. Here you go, chat. You can have this as well. That's absolutely gonna get the other monkeys to think twice about visiting this meeting.
And some powerful get off my lawn energy in that monkey.
Yeah, exactly. How does one train in their language? Years of practice. You have to be an expert. Well, nice. Appreciate this breakdown. We got a nice a bit of context for trade with China and how that relationship has gone, and also kind of comparing the two economies and why you have so much pain at the pump, or you don't, depending on the times. But I appreciate the input from chat, and for you always, Mr. Agent Smith. Everyone's always asking about you. Appreciate your expertise, as usual. And we will see you all on the next episode of Well Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yeah, thanks again. Always a privilege. Talk to you next time.
GG. What sound does a gray langur monkey make?